Now it's time to speak to our guest this week, and I'm delighted to say that it's a man who is one of the silkiest drummers in all of music. Welcome to Vintage Rock Pod, Mr. Pick with us.
Well, thank you, Paul. It's quite a nice introduction, that. I think the best introduction I've heard, in my opinion, I'm a big fan of Pat Metheny, and I went to see him at in Shepherd's Bush, one of the theatres there, and his then drummer was a guy called Paul Vertigo, and Vertigo, and he said, "Now I'd like to introduce my drummer. He's fearless, Mr. Paul Vertigo," and I thought that was great. Fearless.
Fearless. Well, we'll call you Fearless throughout if you like instead. So yes, thank you, Fearless, for joining us.
And that's Paul. That came from somebody attributing an adjective to Paul Vertigo. If it comes from Pat Metheny, then you stay with it. But he's not calling me fearless, But I thought it was something prior to, fearless. It's a great way of playing. Not so much being reckless, being fearless, daring to do things. And a lot of things these days are so predetermined that fearless doesn't enter into it.
Absolutely.
And I liken it to they always had this analogy in music, goes back to the Shadows, where I came from, with the tennis rackets, the kids in the bedroom pretending the tennis racket is a guitar. It's all about that. And the pre-programmed thing now is very much like a football team who doesn't really rely on anything so kind of risque, like creativity or off the cuff. Everything has to be predetermined. So you become like Watford. You just do set pieces, and that's where you score the majority of your goals and function. Yeah, and you don't have silky players. You certainly don't have fearless ones, because they do things that are not expected.
Yeah,
and that's the whole point about the fearless thing, really.
But fearless is probably a good way of describing you and where your musical background came from, because from a very, very early age, you wanted to join like a military marching band kind of thing, didn't you? Because you just wanted to get your hands on the drum, didn't you?
Yes, that's right. I think when you go back to the 50s, the ability to have any experience was very limited. I mean, it was, in a way, it makes stuff simple, but there's one radio, there's one TV, and if you don't encounter stuff on that, then you're not going to really be introduced to it unless you have somebody in the family that is a character. So when I was a kid, the two things that really stood out was this marching band, which paraded around the local neighborhood on the first Sunday of every month. And they belonged to a church. It was what's called a boys' brigade. It's like a youth organization, not dissimilar to the Boy Scouts. But the boys' brigade is more affiliated to the Methodist Church. Okay. And once they get you in there, they want you to be, good Christians and things, So outside of the extracurricular stuff like the band and the wayfaring, camping and stuff, you're obliged to go to church as well, which I didn't really enjoy too much. But you could just spontaneously in those days just walk onto the street and begin to follow them. There wasn't any of the issues that surround such behavior these days. People want to know where their kids are all the time. It just wasn't such a kind of contentious issue in those days. So you would march around, and then when I was old enough, I joined that organization purely to get hold of a drum. But they had everything down packed. It was just basically, well, now you're in the company, you really can't be in the band for a year because you've got to march behind. Otherwise, everybody'd be in the band, but nobody'd be behind. So you do that for a year, and then you go back and you say, well, I've done that. Can I have a drum now? Oh, well, yeah, they all want a drum. You've got to blow the bugle for a year. So I blew my brains out. I can still do a risque last post, which is the big piece on the bugle. The bugle has no valves. Mm-hmm. It's just all pressure on the lips, and it's just 5 notes that you can get. I dare say there are more, but 5 notes is considered the norm. And then after that, in the 3rd year, because there's a natural wastage within the company, because kids go to university, leave, become too old, whatever it is of that nature. So there's always a vacancy, and I got a drum. Parallel to that, I'd already decided that I wanted a drum kit, and this wasn't going to happen from my parents, particularly my mother, who made, I think, similar to all families in those days, the mother made executive decisions. The father put the money on the table and just sat back and just watched things unfold, you know. But the mother made executive decisions. Yes, no, you can't have it, you can have it, you might have it, all that sort of stuff. So within basically 3 months or 4 months, maybe 6 months tops of having this drum, they could see that I was really into it, and they got me a drum kit for the next Christmas. So it's about this time of year, really.
And how old
then
were
I
you at
was
that
just
point
away.
then, when you got your first drum kit for Christmas? How old were you?
Well, I wish I still had it. I wish I still had it, just purely as a sort of piece of nostalgia. You know, it was £14, which probably be about more like £100 in today's money, and it was just what's called an Ajax kit, made by Boozy and Hawkes, and it just 3 pieces, 1, 2, 3 pieces, a hi-hat cymbal, the ones that go like this, and another cymbal which sounded like a dustbin lid, but to me it sounded fantastic. And the band of the time was the Shadows, who, again, really quite fortuitously, I mean, they were an instrumental band, basically. I mean, I know they're renowned for backing Cliff Richard, but I was more interested in them in their own right, and they just played instrumentals, maybe did 1 song per album, but all the stuff was instrumental, and it had to stand up. There's no vocals, so you've got to be able to play, you know. And they always could play, and the rhythm guitar was a rhythm guitar, and they always had a good drummer. First drummer was a guy called Tony Meehan, and the second drummer was a guy called Brian Bennett. And there was always a drum solo on their LPs, and you would learn it, you know, because it was, I wouldn't say I could do it perfectly, but it was within your scope to aspire to doing it. You know, it wasn't Buddy Rich or something astounding pyrotechnically, you know, out of reach, but you still had to be proficient to do a good version of that. And they used to have a drum solo called Little B, which is Little B for Brian Bennett. So I remember with great affection, because it's a really good foundation, you know. I mean, today there's so much choice out there, and drum kits have become so huge that I don't know, it was just less complicated in those days, you know. Once you got started, got beyond go, it was kind of pretty much, music was essentially a live thing. There were no computers, no mobile phones, no color television. You know, it was quite a sensation if somebody had a landline in their house. So if you can imagine 2 cars in the street, one was a Ford Popular and the other one was a Renault Dauphine. I mean, why would you remember that? But I do, you know, from the 50s. It's, you know, it's incredible. And we used to do a lot of playing outside. It was just, you know, you used to amuse yourself. And I think the whole thing about the drum, basically, was there was an issue for my mother about attracting attention from a noise perspective.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, I characterize that kind of neighborhood, that community thing, as being characterized by, if a policeman were to knock at your door, the default position would be, for me, would be, well, what does he want? But my parents and their peers and contemporaries of that era in the 50s would be extremely preoccupied and think, what have we done? Because that represented authority, and once authority came and almost touched you, you had to be kind of fearful, circumspect, and be, you know, somewhat. I mean, a lot of it is diffidence to a painful degree, but that was the kind of community we lived in. So for whatever its pluses and, you know, bonuses were, there was equally stuff that you might think would be not for me. But it's what it is, and it's what most people find themselves in now these days. It's that kids just they don't question anything. It's just before them, and they get on with it, and that's what we did. And the band, the marching band, I became the lead drummer in pretty quick order. Although I wasn't allowed to be the actual total lead drummer because I didn't do enough extracurricular activities with wayfaring and first aid and PE, you know, because I was busy gigging. So they wouldn't promote me from a private. It had an army kind of structure, hierarchical structure. Yeah. You had to be at least lance corporal to be the official lead drummer. So I had to share the duty with this other guy who couldn't play, bless his cotton. But he was a nice guy. His name was Eric Needham. So I remember with great affection that. There was a very good bandmaster called Mr. Bond. It wasn't James Bond, it was a Barry Bond. And he ran a bike shop. So there must have been something quite tangibly real about the whole thing, because I remember it quite clearly, you know. I mean, I don't kind of visit it with any kind of nostalgia. It's just when people press the right buttons, it just all comes to mind. And you come in. Sorry, the dog's coming.
It's okay.
That's what it is.
What's the dog called?
West Highland Terrier, you see. Yeah. Thinking of you.
Lovely.
Well, that was that, the Shadows, basically. And when the Beatles happened, it was just, the gloves were off. Everybody just went crazy.
Yeah.
I was still at school and playing in bands that could play in the social clubs in the Leicester area, and there were many of those because, as I mentioned before, everything was kind of driven by a live event.
Yeah,
you know, there wasn't, television was still in its fledgling years, basically. So although it was becoming competition, there was still an ingrained habit of going out and being entertained by live music. So you would play in these big social clubs or affiliated clubs, which were supposed to be non-profit making organizations, and they would basically subsidize their beer and have trips to the seaside, to Skegness behind me and stuff, and they would have a concert hall. So, and they would have entertainment, maybe three acts over a weekend. One would be a singer, one would be a ventriloquist, and when the Beatles came along, they all wanted Little Beatles. So and I remember once I was still at school, and what was really nice about it was that it was a free ride for me, because I was always the youngest in the early years. So I just went along for the trip, really. I didn't have to make decisions. I didn't have to make any conscious decisions about what songs to play. I could just turn up for rehearsal and do it and just get on with learning how things work. And they said, we'll have an early rehearsal on Friday after school. Be there as soon as you can. Fridays was the day that pop records, singles were released universally throughout the country. So one of the lads had ordered a Beatles record. It was I Want to Hold Your Hand. And the idea was for him to hot-foot it from the shop to the house where we rehearsed, put it on the turntable, learn how to listen to it, learn how to play it, and play it in the social club that evening, be the first group in Leicester to play it, you know, like a little kind of fillip, you know. And so there were a whole load of little things going on like that, which made life very prescribed in a way. You know, I didn't worry about what I was doing. You know, I just, rehearsal, 4 o'clock, 4:30, off I go, you know. Thought nothing of, you know, being there all night and coming home in the dark, you know, with the drums, like hat boxes and all the kind of silly little comments you get. They're big hats, because, you know, the boxes are basically just big round boxes, and, you know, and I was very painfully shy in those days. You know, we just weren't versed at being outward going. You know, we lived very sheltered lives. So this whole thing just opened up a whole new potential vista for me. And eventually I kind of percolated up the running order and eventually played in what would be possibly construed as the second most respected band in Leicester. And we stopped playing social clubs and did dance halls, and we had a Ford Thames van, which was a step up from a Bedford Dormobile, and we would then travel outside of the city limits, which was really more exciting, and play places like Peterborough and Lincoln, do the GI air bases and stuff, and start to get exposed to other stuff, because you go to an American air base in those days, it's like Little America. So you would hear American records and what's that, and your whole potential for influence starts to instead of going on a power line, starts to open out exponentially. And it's the same with the Liverpool. Liverpool was a huge port, very, very busy port. It's still a port, but it's not as busy as it used to be. And there'll be a transfer of information from New York. The guys would play on the liners, and guys would be on the cargo ships and go into New York, into Manhattan, bring records back. And that's how the Beatles were initially influenced, So as soon as they were, an entity in Germany, there I found myself in this respected group in Leicester, and we started doing auditions in London with a view to going to Germany. Oh, okay. And again, it's the same old thing, same old routine. Once you're going to Germany to work, you can't hold down a day job. You become almost like professional by default, not as a conscious decision. I mean, it's obviously a consequence of what you do. You have to be good at it, but it's everything. All the incremental things just begin to step up until you look at each other and think, this is better than having a proper job, really, isn't it? Let's see how long we can do it. And that's a common kind of recurring theme for people from my generation who have had careers, so to speak, in the music business, because we come from the same kind of stock. Because irrespective of where you were, apart from little centres like London, maybe, where there's much more a cross-pollination of ideas, and ideas take root in different cultures. Leicester was a very provincial city. So upon reflection, I consider myself really fortunate to have been born when I was, to be at the right age to maximize what was there for the taking, and it's a bit of good fortune and a lot of perseverance and a lot of an element of luck, but you have to have some ability as well to potentially benefit from.
You definitely had the ability. I mean, you had the hard work as well. Tell us a bit about the time in Germany then, because while you were there was some grueling shifts, wasn't it? Was it up to 10 hours a day playing songs and things like that?
Play in some places, I mean, about where they would put you. We went to Hamburg first and played in 3 clubs there. That wasn't kind of so bad, because it's another port, and you get all this cross-fertilization of ideas and stuff. But when we started going to places like Nuremberg, a lot of it went over the top of my head. I didn't think Nuremberg, war trials. I just thought, Nuremberg, it looks like a Gothic city to me. I didn't think about war trials at all. And we played in this club, which was, again, I mean, it's patently an escort bar. These girls, a bit like, would dance, be hostesses, and they would dance with people who came in off the street. And I was so green, Paul. I didn't really clock it at the time. I just saw little cameos of, scenes going on. It was like an L-shaped room. We played for 45 minutes on and 15 off for about at least 6 hours. And then at the weekends, we would do an afternoon shift where they would let very young people, young teenagers in. But you know, as Germany was in those days, I mean, they may have lost the war, but they certainly won an element of the peace because they had a much more liberal kind of lifestyle. You know, I mean, places weren't closing until 4 o'clock in the morning. You know, we were walking out and it was almost daylight. We'd been working there from 8 o'clock until 4. But you learnt a lot. You learnt on the job, and sometimes in some of the clubs you played with another group, and there's almost that wonderful camaraderie between, you know, people that are from the same country when they're abroad. You know, it kind of galvanizes you into this kind of coherent social unit, and you take succor from being, you know, around other people. And again, you have you know, you listen to them playing because you're in that situation in a club. But there were some unsavory characters in these places, you know. There was one guy in a place called, I played in a place called Cuxhaven, which is like a little port in the Baltic, and it was, I mean, it was bloody freezing, you know, in the winter. You know, the sea would ice over. But we played in this small little club, and we played for about 6 hours, 45 on, 15 off. And when we were with the 15 off, we lived above the stage, and I was going to go up and have a cup of tea or something. And the owner pointed to me. He said, "Peek at you," and he goes, and he pointed me to this table out in the club, and it was like a lady, and she had bought me a beer and a schnapps, and it was customary to drink them. Well, I have no tolerance, you see. So it's quite funny, and the other guys are laughing, and then they play for another hour, 45 minutes, and have to go again because the guy's selling beer, and it's the custom is to show respect and to drink the schnapps and then chase it with the beer chaser, you know. So I'm starting to lose the plot here, you know, sort of, and I just didn't make the rest of the gig. I just climbed on the stage and fell off, you know, and paid for it the next morning with it all headache and hangover, the snow spot.